Yo, what's up everybody? Nico here, and in this video I'll be editing 3 photos from my editing challenge that I did on Instagram and showing you everything that I did to achieve the final look. And yeah, so without further ado, let's jump straight into Lightroom and Photoshop and show you what I did. So as I mentioned before, I'll be editing 3 photos. The first one is from Scotland, and you can always see up here in the corner who took the photo. So this is the before and this is the after. Quite a dramatic change, and I believe I received the most messages about this photo and how I did it. So now I'll be going over it. The second one is this clean but very nice forest photo, and this is the before and this is the after. Also a pretty dramatic change. And this is the last photo, the before, and here is the after. Let's get straight to editing the first photo. Basic adjustments. I changed the white balance, like made it slightly cooler to about -20 because the photo was just way too warm. And then a lot of contrast because it's a JPEG and didn't have too much details in it, so contrast also about 20. And then I went for the highlights, lowered them to about -60, and then bring back some of the shadows to 50. From here I'm lowering the blacks to about -30 to give it back some contrast. And I just noticed there's a dehaze for like -32. So reset this. And yeah, clarity, recently I tend to lower my clarity for this photo about -40 seems right. For the vibrance, I'll also be lowering this one to about -10. Going on further to the tone curves, right here I made like a simple S, but still protecting the highlights, so putting down the shadows and slightly lifting up in the mid areas. Yeah, that seems right. Then moving on to the HSL. For the reds, I pulled down the saturation to about -30 and the luminance to, I made it a bit brighter. Then the oranges, hue, -6 seems right. And then the saturation to +30. Luminance goes up a little bit too. So the yellows, -10 on the hue, -70 on the saturation, and luminance I boosted that up to 100 to give it more details in the darker areas. So going for the greens, big changes here. On the hue, -50 and +90 on the saturation. And then also the luminance goes down, -50 seems alright. Moving on to the aquas, just bring the luminance to about 30. Desaturating the blues, so -60 seems right. And then boosting the luminance to about 70. Not doing anything to the purple or the magenta. Then moving on to the color grading. Right here, my regular settings at the moment are around a hue of 210 roughly for the shadows, and saturation is going to be 15. And then on the highlights, I'll be using a hue of around 50 and a saturation of 5. That seems right. For the vignette, I'm going to like -20. That seems good. For the calibration, I'm doing on the hue like a -30-ish, so I get that more orangey greens. You see, that's the difference. That's pretty much how I get all of my vibrant orangey photos at the moment. And one thing that does huge difference is going back to the basic panel to profile and changing this to the artistic for. And now comes the dramatic part. I did the sky replacement and the birds in Luminar 4, but you can also do it in Adobe Photoshop. I made a video on that like 2 weeks ago. Open Luminar. It's going to take a few seconds to load the photo. Okay, there we go. Still in German, but I'll sort of translate it. So right here, I'm just going ahead and choosing on the creative panel the AI sky replacement, and I selected the dramatic sky 3, which does a pretty nice job. And yeah, basically going to extended settings, and the sky temperature, I want to lower this a little bit. And let's see, play around with the brightness, not doing too much right here. Slightly changing the position of the horizon to somewhere around there. That seems pretty nice. So the second thing that I did was AI augmented sky, and right here I chose the birds 1. Just click apply up here in the corner, and it's going to process it and load it back into Lightroom. Alright, back here in Lightroom, I did a few more minor changes. Since the sky is sort of purplish, I just lowered the purple and magenta saturation, and then went for color grading and added a like slightly bluish tint, somewhat around like 200 for the hue and 15 for the saturation. And then another thing that I did was pretty quickly clone stamping this person out, so not being very precise here. So okay, and that's it. Pretty dramatic change, don't you think? Alright, moving on to the second photo is this one. Starting off here in the basics panel, I lowered the temperature of the photo to around 4050 and changed the tint to +16, so brought in a little bit more of the greens. Then I also added a lot of contrast to around 30. Didn't do anything about the highlights, but added a bit of like the shadows to about 10, and the whites I upped those to about 40-ish, 45, and then -30 for the blacks to bring in some more contrast. And then right here, clarity again, lowered this to around -10, and for the vibrance I brought this up to about +20. And then going on to the tone curve, just slightly lower the shadows, give it a bit more contrast. Then already moving on to the HSL. On the reds, I just brought the reds slightly towards the oranges by adding +15-ish, but for the oranges I lowered them to -15 on the hue, saturation -100, and luminance just brightened those a bit. For the yellows, -70 on the hue, +30 on the saturation. Boost those also a bit to 45-ish. And then for the greens, just lower the hue to -20, leave the saturation as it is, and just brighten them a little bit, +15 on the luminance. For the aquas, -10 on the hue, saturation also goes down to about -35, and the luminance goes to -30 as well. Okay, blues. On the hue, -5 seems right to me. Saturation goes down to -65, and the luminance goes down to about -30. For the purple and the magenta, I lowered both of them on the saturation to about -80. This seems right. Moving on to the color grading, again on the shadows, around 210 and a saturation of 15. And for the highlights, a hue of 50 and again 5 on the saturation. For the effects, again on the vignette, around -25, did feather it a little bit more to around 65. And now here comes some big changes on the calibration. For the reds, I boosted the hue to around +90 and lowered the saturation just slightly to -5. For the greens, I also changed the hue towards the oranges and yellows to around 75 and the saturation to around -10. Now you're starting to see the changes where I move from the green leaves to the yellow orangey leaves. But the biggest change is in the blue primary. I pretty much changed the hue completely to -100, and for the saturation I boosted those up to +100. Okay, and again I chose the Artistic 4 to give it the blue tint, and due to the edit, some of these leaves aren't very yellow, they're pretty much completely blue. So I'm going ahead, adding some local adjustments. 45 on the temperature seems alright. And then just going over here on these leaves, just like so. Nice. And also over here on those leaves. So some quick and dirty local adjustments, like so. Adding a second local adjustment, lowering the saturation and just going over here to reduce some more of the orange and purple in the trees right here, like so. So the leaves in the center are the main focus. Yeah, nice. That seems good to me. This is the last photo taken by Long Explorer, a good friend of mine. And I'm starting off with the white balance. I lowered that one just slightly. I brought up the exposure to roughly 0.8. And for the contrast as well, boosted it to around 20. Then lowered the highlights to -100, boosted the shadows to +50, and the whites I also just upped those slightly to +5, and for the blacks again to add some more contrast, -35 seems good. Then clarity, lowered that to -40 as on the first one. Subtlety haze here to +10, and vibrance goes down to -10 as well. So for the tone curve, pretty much the same curve as on the first one, slightly lifting the highlights and lowering the blacks to give it more contrast. Then moving on to the HSL, I lowered the saturation of the reds to about -30 and raised the luminance to 70. Then I changed the orange hue to +20, the saturation goes up to 30, and the luminance, I'll lower this to around -15. Then for the yellows, -30 on the hue, +20 on the saturation, and 100 plus on the luminance. As you can see, it does a dramatic change on the sky. Also the green, the yellow jacket and the greenery in the foreground. Then changing the greens to -50 on the hue, and lowering the luminance to around, yeah, -80 seems right. Going for the aquas, only changed the luminance to +30. Then the blues, -60 on the saturation, and for the luminance +15 seems good. Moving on to the color grading, yet again somewhat around 210, 220 for the hue, and saturation again around 15, and saturation this time around 5-ish. So moving on to the highlights on this one, you know the drill. Hue goes to 50 and saturation to 10. And yeah, for the effects again, add a vignette to around -20. And just as the last one, I'll be boosting the saturation of the blues. And this is what I described earlier. This is blue saturation on roughly 0. And check this out. It changes so much of the photo. And from here, I'm also lowering the hue to around -30. So see the difference that these two changes made. And also I'll be adding my sort of lens flare over here, like this. Always click invert, feather to 100. And I'll be adding a temperature of around, let's say, 40-ish. Boosting the exposure to about 2. Moving on to the contrast. Right here, -40 for the highlights. I will boost those to +100. Shadows. Yeah, I'm just lowering the shadows slightly. And for the clarity, -60. Do a little bit of dehaze in the negative direction. And then saturation goes down to about -20. Having like this. And this is the third photo done, and I hope you enjoyed it. So yeah, that's it, and I will be doing this again in the future, basically giving you the opportunity to send me your photos so I can edit them, and then going ahead and showing the top few edits here on YouTube, basically walking through everything I did. So I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, give it a thumbs down, and yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.